Imagine you spent 30 years of your life building something. Not a business, not a career, something more personal than that. You spent 30 years working, long hours, hard decisions, sacrifices you made so that your family didn't have to. And over those 30 years, you saved. Every month, a portion of your labor went into a savings account because that's what responsible people do. You delay gratification today so that tomorrow is more secure. Now imagine that after 30 years of this, after 30 years of discipline and sacrifice, you open your account and discover that the purchasing power of everything you saved has been cut in half. Not by a market crash, not by a bad investment, not by anything you did wrong, just by the slow, steady, invisible drain of inflation. The money is still there, every dollar accounted for. But each dollar buys half of what it used to. What was stolen from you? Time. 30 years of your life, quietly drained away by a monetary system most people never think to question. This video is about that system, where it came from, how it works, and why humanity spent thousands of years trying to build something better, something we call sound money. And it's about the moment we threw all of that away. Let's start at the beginning. Money is one of the oldest and most important technologies in human history. I use the word technology deliberately because that's what money is. It's a tool that solves one of the most fundamental problems in human cooperation. How do you trade with someone when what you have isn't what they want right now? Economists call this the double coincidence of wants. If you're a farmer with extra wheat and you need shoes, you have to find a shoemaker who not only makes shoes, but also happens to need wheat at exactly the same moment. In a small village, this might work occasionally. In a complex society, it breaks down almost immediately. Money solves this problem. Instead of trading goods directly, you trade goods for a universally accepted medium, something that everyone agrees has value, and then you trade that medium for whatever you actually need. The farmer sells wheat for money. Later, he buys shoes with money. The shoemaker doesn't need to want wheat. The transaction is decoupled across time and space. Simple idea, profound consequences. But here's what most people miss. Not everything makes good money. Throughout history, humans have experimented with hundreds of different monetary substances: shells, beads, cattle, salt, iron, copper, cloth. Most of them failed. Some of them failed spectacularly. And the reason they failed always came down to the same set of properties. Good money needs to be durable. It can't rot, rust, or deteriorate. A monetary substance that degrades over time fails as a store of value. Good money needs to be divisible. You need to be able to break it into smaller units for smaller transactions without losing value. Good money needs to be portable. You need to be able to carry meaningful wealth without requiring a cart or a warehouse. Good money needs to be fungible. Every unit needs to be interchangeable with every other unit. $1 needs to be exactly as good as any other dollar. And most critically, good money needs to be scarce. This is the property that matters most and the one most often overlooked. If something is abundant, it cannot store value. If I can pick up monetary shells off any beach, those shells cannot represent stored labor. The moment supply expands easily, the purchasing power of existing units is diluted. Your stored labor becomes worth less. And the people who control the supply of money, whoever they are, become, in a very real sense, able to extract wealth from everyone else. Scarcity is not a flaw in a monetary system. Scarcity is the foundation of everything. This is why, after centuries of monetary experimentation, humanity kept returning to the same two substances, gold and silver. Gold is remarkable, not because it's pretty, though it is, but because its physical properties make it almost uniquely suited to serve as money. Gold doesn't rust. It doesn't corrode. A gold coin buried in the earth for 2,000 years comes out looking almost exactly as it went in. Civilizations rise and fall, empires are conquered and forgotten, and the gold remains. Durable beyond any other common metal, gold is divisible. You can melt it, pour it, stamp it into coins of precise weights. You can trade a fraction of an ounce as easily as you can trade a bar. Gold is portable in the sense that matters most. A small amount contains significant value. An ounce of gold weighs about 28 grams. At almost any point in recorded history, that 28 grams could purchase a meaningful amount of goods, a week's wages, a fine garment, a quantity of food. You could carry a year's worth of savings in your pocket. Gold is fungible. An ounce of pure gold is an ounce of pure gold, regardless of where it came from or who previously owned it. And gold is scarce, genuinely, persistently, stubbornly scarce, in a way that no human institution can easily override. The total amount of gold ever mined in human history would fill roughly 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. Despite thousands of years of mining, gold's annual production has rarely exceeded 2% of total existing supply. You cannot print gold. You cannot conjure it from thin air. To get more gold, you have to find it, dig it out of the earth, and refine it, at great cost and effort. This property, what economists call the stock-to-flow ratio, the ratio of existing supply to new annual production, is what makes gold uniquely suited as a long-term store of value. And for most of recorded human history, gold served that function remarkably well. But gold has a problem. Actually, it has several. Gold is heavy. Moving large amounts of gold across long distances is expensive and dangerous. As trade networks expanded and economies grew more complex, the physical movement of gold became a bottleneck. Gold is also hard to verify. Is this coin pure? Is it the right weight? Counterfeiting and coin clipping, shaving small amounts of metal off the edges of coins, were persistent problems throughout monetary history. These practical limitations gave rise to one of the most important financial innovations in history: the gold receipt. Here's how it worked. Goldsmiths and early banks would accept deposits of gold for safekeeping. In exchange, they would issue paper receipts, promises to pay the bearer a specified amount of gold on demand. These receipts were easier to carry, easier to transfer, and easier to verify than gold itself. Over time, people began trading the receipts instead of the gold. The receipts became money. This was the birth of paper money. And for a long time, it worked beautifully. The paper was a claim on real gold. Every receipt could, in principle, be redeemed for physical metal. The paper was simply a more convenient representation of sound money. Notice what's happening here. The paper money system started as a technology built on top of gold. A layer of convenience over a foundation of scarcity and physical reality. The paper derived its value from the gold. And as long as that link held, as long as every receipt could be redeemed for the metal it represented, the system was honest. The problem is that the system created a temptation, a profound, almost irresistible temptation. If you are the bank, and you hold 1,000 ounces of gold, and you have issued 1,000 receipts, and you notice that on any given day, only a small fraction of receipt holders ever actually come to redeem their gold, then you might start to wonder, what if you issued more receipts than you have gold? What if you issued 1,100 receipts for 1,000 ounces? 1,200? Most people would never notice. Most people would never redeem. You could lend out the extra receipts, collect interest, and pocket the profit. This practice, issuing more claims than you have assets, is called fractional reserve banking. And once it began, it never really stopped. It just evolved. The temptation of fractional reserve banking is the temptation at the heart of all fiat money. It is the temptation to create claims on wealth that exceed the actual wealth that exists, to harvest the labor of savers without their knowledge or consent, to expand the money supply beyond what reality permits. And it is a temptation that, again and again throughout history, governments and financial institutions have been unable to resist. Let's talk about the history of monetary debasement. Because it didn't start in 1971. It didn't start in the 20th century. It is as old as civilization itself. And the pattern repeats with remarkable consistency across cultures, continents, and centuries. Ancient Rome is perhaps the most instructive example. In the early Roman Republic, the denarius was a silver coin of high purity, roughly 95% silver. It was reliable, respected, and accepted across the known world. Roman soldiers were paid in denarii. Merchants priced goods in denarii. The denarius was sound money. But Rome had a problem that every expanding empire eventually faces. War is expensive, infrastructure is expensive, bread and circuses are expensive, and as the empire grew, its fiscal demands grew with it. Emperors needed more money than their taxes could provide. The solution they hit upon was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences. Instead of minting new silver coins, which required actual silver, they began mixing the silver with cheaper metals: copper, lead, tin. The coins looked similar. They carried the same denominations, but they contained less and less actual silver. This is monetary debasement, and the Romans practiced it for centuries. Under Nero, the denarius was about 90% silver. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, it was around 75%. By the crisis of the 3rd century, it had fallen below 5%. The denarius was, in any meaningful sense, no longer a silver coin. It was a copper coin with a silver wash, a thin coating of silver to maintain the illusion of value. The consequences were exactly what you would expect. Prices rose. Trade contracted. Trust eroded. The Roman economy, which had been one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, fragmented and collapsed inward. Soldiers refused to accept the debased coins. Local economies retreated to barter. The monetary system that had knit together an empire of 60 million people simply stopped working. Historians debate the causes of Rome's fall. But the collapse of sound money was not a peripheral factor. It was central. An empire cannot function without a trustworthy medium of exchange. And an empire whose rulers cannot resist the temptation to debase that medium is an empire in decline. The Roman story is not unique. The same pattern appears in ancient China, in medieval Europe, in the Byzantine Empire, in the Ottoman Empire, in revolutionary France, in Weimar Germany, in 20th century Zimbabwe, in 21st century Venezuela. The details change, the currencies change, the names of the rulers change. The pattern does not. Every time a monetary authority gains control over the money supply, the temptation to expand that supply beyond what reality permits is eventually acted upon. And every time that temptation is acted upon, the same consequences follow: rising prices, eroding savings, economic distortion, social fracture, and eventual crisis. This is not a controversial observation. It is one of the most consistently documented phenomena in economic history. And yet, despite this record, the 20th century made a decision that would have astonished most monetary thinkers of the preceding millennia. It decided to abandon sound money entirely. The story of how this happened is complicated, but the key moments are clear. World War I broke the classical gold standard. The combatant nations needed to spend far more than their gold reserves permitted, so they suspended gold convertibility to finance the war. After the war, they tried to return to gold but couldn't agree on the terms. The global monetary system lurched through the 1920s in a kind of half-gold, half-paper limbo. The Great Depression delivered another blow. When economies contracted and banks failed, governments desperate to stimulate growth found themselves constrained by gold. You couldn't simply print money to rescue failing banks or fund public works programs if every dollar had to be backed by gold. The gold standard, in their view, was the problem. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took the United States off the domestic gold standard. American citizens were ordered to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars. Private gold ownership was made illegal. The link between the dollar and gold was severed for American citizens, even as it was nominally maintained for foreign governments. After World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement established a new international monetary order. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. It was a gold standard at one remove. The dollar, as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold held at Fort Knox. This system worked reasonably well for 2 decades, but it contained a fatal flaw. The United States was spending heavily on the Vietnam War, on the Great Society programs, and financing that spending by printing dollars. Foreign governments, watching American dollars accumulate in their reserves, began to wonder whether the gold backing was real. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began converting its dollar reserves into gold, essentially calling Washington's bluff. The bluff was real. The United States did not have enough gold to back all the dollars it had printed. And on August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on television and announced that the United States would no longer honor the dollar's convertibility to gold. The last link between money and physical reality was cut. It is worth pausing on what exactly happened on August 15, 1971. Nixon described it as a temporary measure, a technical adjustment to protect the dollar from speculators, a responsible act of monetary stewardship in difficult times. It was none of those things. What happened on August 15, 1971, was that the most powerful nation in the world unilaterally defaulted on its monetary obligations to every country that held dollars. It declared, in effect, that the receipts it had issued were no longer redeemable for gold. The warehouse was still taking deposits, but it was no longer honoring withdrawals. Every currency in the world pegged to the dollar became simultaneously unmoored from gold. In a single afternoon, the entire global monetary system transitioned from a system grounded in physical reality to a system grounded in nothing but institutional trust and legal compulsion. For the first time in history, every major currency on Earth was fiat currency simultaneously. Think about what this means for the concept of savings. Under a sound money system, under gold, saving was rational. If you worked hard, earned money, and put it aside, that money would hold its value. The purchasing power of your stored labor was protected by the physical scarcity of the monetary substance itself. No government, no central bank, no institution could dilute your savings without your consent because they couldn't print gold. Under a fiat system, saving becomes, in a real sense, irrational. The money in your savings account is not protected by physical scarcity. It is protected only by the restraint of the institution that controls its supply. And as we have seen, in Rome, in Weimar Germany, in every historical case where monetary authorities faced fiscal pressure, that restraint is temporary. The temptation is too great, the mechanism too convenient. This is not a theoretical concern. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost more than 85% of its purchasing power. An item that cost $1 in 1971 costs roughly $7 today. The person who saved $1 in 1971 and kept it in a savings account has watched the purchasing power of that dollar shrink by more than 6/7. Their stored labor was not preserved. It was slowly, quietly, continuously extracted. And the extraction was not random. It was directed, through the Cantillon effect we discussed in our last video, toward those closest to the money creation process, toward asset owners, toward financial institutions, toward those whose wealth is stored not in dollars but in things that rise in price as the dollar falls. Real estate, stocks, art, gold. The people who could afford to own assets got richer. The people who could only afford to save dollars got poorer. This is not a side effect of the fiat system. It is the system working as designed. Now, if you've been listening carefully, you might be asking yourself a question. If sound money, gold-backed money, was so much better, why did we abandon it? Were the people who made these decisions simply corrupt? Simply foolish? The honest answer is more complicated. The gold standard had real limitations. It was deflationary in ways that were genuinely painful during economic contractions. When the money supply couldn't expand, debt became more burdensome in real terms. Debtors suffered, banks failed, unemployment rose. The rigid discipline of gold, which was its great virtue in normal times, became its great liability in crisis. The people who dismantled the gold standard believed, many of them genuinely, that a managed currency, guided by expert economists, could deliver the benefits of sound money without its rigidities. They believed that enlightened monetary policy could smooth out the boom and bust cycle, prevent depressions, maintain full employment, and deliver prosperity more reliably than the blunt instrument of gold. They were wrong, but it took decades for the wrongness to become fully visible. And by then, the institutions, the incentives, and the intellectual frameworks built around fiat money had become deeply entrenched. This is where we have lived for the past 50 years. In a world of managed currencies, where the supply of money is determined not by physical reality, but by the decisions of central bankers, politicians, and financial institutions whose interests are not always aligned with yours. And this is why Bitcoin matters. Not as a speculative asset, not as a get-rich-quick scheme, but as an answer to a problem that is as old as civilization itself. Bitcoin is the first monetary technology in history that combines the scarcity properties of gold with the portability and divisibility of digital information. Its supply is fixed, not by a promise, not by an institution, not by a government, but by mathematics that no authority can override. There will be 21 million Bitcoin. Not because Satoshi said so, and we trust him, because the code says so, and the code runs on thousands of independent nodes that no single entity controls. You cannot debase Bitcoin. You cannot clip its coins. You cannot suspend its convertibility in a national emergency. You cannot call it in and replace it with something less valuable. The monetary policy of Bitcoin is the most transparent, predictable, and tamper-resistant monetary policy in human history. Think about what that means for the person who saves. Under Bitcoin, saving is rational again. If you store your labor in Bitcoin, your stored labor is protected not by institutional restraint, but by mathematical certainty. The supply cannot be expanded. The protocol cannot be changed without the consensus of a decentralized network that no single government or institution controls. Your purchasing power is not subject to the decisions of people whose interests may not align with yours. This is what sound money means. Not just technically, philosophically. Sound money is money that cannot be weaponized against the people who hold it. Money that is honest about what it is. A representation of real labor, real time, real human energy, rather than a promise that can be quietly broken when inconvenient. Money that rewards patience and penalizes extraction. Money that aligns the incentives of savers with the long-term health of civilization. Humanity spent thousands of years searching for sound money. We found it in gold and used it to build some of the most remarkable achievements in our history. We abandoned it in a single afternoon in 1971 and have been living with the consequences ever since. We are now, for the first time in human history, being offered something better than gold. Something with all of gold's scarcity and none of its physical limitations. Something that can be verified instantly, transmitted globally, divided infinitely, and stored without a vault. The question is whether we will recognize it for what it is. History suggests we might not, at first. Every monetary revolution has been met with skepticism, resistance, and ridicule before it was met with acceptance. The paper receipt was once considered an absurd substitute for real metal. The idea that a digital protocol could serve as money sounds, to many people today, equally absurd. But the properties don't lie. The mathematics doesn't negotiate. And the history of what happens to civilizations that abandon sound money is not ambiguous. The question isn't whether sound money matters. The question is whether this time, we build something that can't be taken away. If this channel is asking the right questions, if you believe that money is the foundation everything else rests on, then subscribe and share this with someone who's ready to go deeper. Because we're just getting started.